Hello, folks. Welcome to this overview of how to analyze a poem, because words have power. All right, so we're going to be looking at week 3. If you haven't already, this is in under course materials, content, course schedule, and week 3. I asked you to read the PDF, How to Analyze a Poem, first. So if you haven't done that, pause the video and check it out. Then go over to poetryfoundation.org and read the poem by Bailey Collins, which I'm going to do right now. Introduction to Poetry by Bailey Collins. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beginning it with a hose to find out what it really means. For those of you who may have had negative experiences with analyzing the true meaning of poetry, then you know exactly what this poem is about. Now, many of the much of the discussion in how to analyze a poem from the Learning Center goes over many of the things we're going to look at here. So, Introduction to Poetry. The title has a literal meaning. Here's an introduction to poetry, but it also has an illusionary meaning. An illusion is where there's a reference in one component, one text to another text, or an idea, or a cultural product like a movie, or even cereal like Fruit Loops. But in this case, Introduction to Poetry is also a reference to Introduction to Poetry, a class, similar to what we might be doing in this class and talking about poetry. So when he says, I asked him to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, many of you may be like, huh? But in the old days, when they took photographs with film rather than your phone, you could make it into a print or a slide. And the slide was actually a film negative of the picture itself, and you would put it in a slide projector and it would project it onto the wall. So when he's saying color slide, that's what he's referring to. Taking it and holding it up to the light. Now, when you look at a color slide in your hand without light, it's slightly warbly and you can't see the image. But when you put it to the light, you see the details and the photograph itself. So if that's the case, then Collins is saying if you hold it up to the light, you can see what a poem is really about. And Collins was all about accessible poetry, poetry that you get just by reading it. And so in his mind, poetry was like a house. And if the poet was doing his job or her job, then the door was wide open and allowed people to come in and look around. And that's what he's inviting people to do. Come into a poem and look around. The other possibility is to press an ear against its hive. Here is the use of figurative language. So what kind of figurative language is that? Metaphor, simile, something else? You tell me. But when you press an ear against its hive, then you hear the buzzing and the movement of the bees inside. In other words, sometimes understanding a poem is about hearing it read, listening to it, and feeling what happens when you hear the poem out loud. Another option is dropping a mouse into a poem and watching him probe his way out. This is the idea of, obviously, again, a use of figurative language. Obviously, the mouse in this case is the person coming into a poem and just feeling their way around and seeing what's inside. And again, he uses another use of figurative language, saying that the poem is a room. And when we walk around inside it, we're looking for the light switch to turn it on, to see what secret things might exist within it. When he says water ski across the surface of a poem, that means, enjoy it for the thrill of it, Just check it out. And waving at the author's name on the shore. A lot of times when we talk about literature, we talk about literature with a capital L, as if it's something big and um, unapproachable and put on a pedestal. And certain poems are good poems because they were written by famous poets. And what Collins is saying is, who cares who the author is? It's all about the poem and the experience of the poem. But oftentimes, because of how we were taught to read poetry in school, we want to tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession of it. We want to know, what does this poem really mean? And the reality is, what a poem means is based on an element of literary analysis called a narrative gap. A narrative gap is an opening in a text that is intended to be filled by the reader and clues from the text. In other words, what exactly does the opening stanza of this poem mean? We know this because we can literally translate the meaning. But if you guys didn't know what a color slide was, then how are you going to analyze the meaning of the poem? You needed a little more cultural context to understand what Collins was talking about, which I provided. Now, the question would be, if you're reading a poem and you're like, I don't know what that means, then perhaps you could do a quick little Google search to find out. And so we'll do that. Look what happens when you put in color slide. Color transparency mounted usually between cardboard or plastic masks or glass plates for projection onto a screen. So what do they look like? Oh, there's one there. Here's one. Oh, sorry about that. Here's a great example. We can see this couple standing in the doorway of that building because the person who's holding the slide is holding it up to the light. So sometimes when we don't understand the literal meaning of a poem or a reference in a poem, then we look it up. On the other hand, we can look at it in terms of the simile, which we see here. And we know this because it uses like or as. So like a color slide, we can take a poem and expand it and explore it and see what it really means. And it doesn't have to have a specific, definitive, this is what this poem means. Because each one of us brings something different to a poem. Because we have a different cultural experience, a different cultural identity. But it's important to note that even though we experience a poem differently, that does not mean that a poem could be interpreted to mean anything based on our experience. We have to base the filling of the narrative gaps using the context for the poem. For instance, we couldn't say that color slide in this instance is a reference to this kind of color slide. This is not what Billy Collins is talking about. But for many of us, this may be what we thought of if we're not familiar with the other kind of color slides. Not much happens when you hold a slide like this up to the light. So poetry does have flexibility, but you can't push it so far that it refers to something that the author or poet really isn't talking about. Now, in this class, we're not going to break it down to the tiniest of things. We're going to explore the different ways we can see meaning in a poem. And we're going to do things like press our ear against its hive, water ski across the surface, and wave at the author's name on the shore. We're going to look at what different components go into creating a powerful poem by looking at the poetry of Margarita Engel, the Cuban-American poet, who happens to be the Young People's Poet Laureate for the U.S. right now. And we're also going to be looking at the work of Naomi Shihab Nye. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because I really admire the work of Naomi Shihab Nye, but also because I think that the collection we're reading is extremely relevant to our world today. So I hope this quick reading of Introduction to Poetry gives you some ideas of how to apply what you learned in how to analyze a poem so that you can get some ideas on how to use that guidance to analyze the poems we're going to look at in class. But I am here to answer any further questions you have about reading and analyzing poetry. But most importantly, allow yourself some time to read the poem out loud, to just enjoy how it sounds and what it makes you think and feel. Allow yourself to just explore the poem by looking for the light switch inside it. And then, maybe give it a little more analysis. But enjoy it first, because that's what poetry is meant to do. Allow us to see the world around us in a new way. You can't do that if you don't give the poem a chance to settle in and for your mind to explore what it means without having to tie it to a chair and beat a confession out of it. Thank you very much. Have a great day.